a lot of swearing. In fact, I'm going to swear 10 times, and if you swear along with me, your Jira instance will be better tomorrow than it is today. Okay, so here's the first swear. I will avoid unnecessary configurations and over customization. So if you're like me, you probably already have too many schemes and too many customizations. So before you can clean up what you already have, you've got to stop that bleeding and prevent more unnecessary modification. Sounds easy, right? How do you do that? Well, the first is by setting standards, crafting usable policies to support your procedures, and utilizing project templates. All right, so let's talk a little bit about each one. So whether you've just started using Jira or you've been using it for many years, it's such a powerful application, and I really don't believe it should be directed by a single person. I think you should set up a governance or a steering committee so you can establish standards, policies, and really look after the application as a whole. So I've listed just a few of the duties of my advisory board. And of course, you'll need to define your own, but hopefully this will help you get started. And my favorite here is defend and protect application health and future. I really believe if there isn't somebody standing by doing that, you're never going to get to a good place. All right, so who should be on this board that you're going to set up? My recommendations are listed, but the worst person to have on your board is someone who only cares their Jira project or some special feature that they need today. So don't be afraid to replace those people or any board member who's not considering the long-term health of the entire application and how it impacts your mission. And you know, these board members, they don't need to have Jira admin permissions. They can help from the background. All right, so hopefully now you have a start to a strategy for an advisory board. Next thing I need is specific policies to your application health. So I recommend writing a policy for all of these things, for customization, application security, protecting and preventing sharing of sensitive information, and then any specific regulations for your country or your industry. So this is my favorite policy. I think the customization policy is the most important one to have. You guys know as Jira administrators, sometimes you have to say no to a request, and it's really hard. It's hard to tell your boss or your friend that no, you're not gonna make their customization change. But if you have a policy in place to support you with that, it's much easier to explain why and enforce it. All right, so what elements should a good policy include? I've listed some of my ideas. I'm sure you have others. But you can download my free customization policy worksheet to help you craft your own. It's free as part of my Jira Strategy Admin Workbook. All right, next up is application security. So this policy usually says what you can and can't do with all your company applications, including Jira. But come on, when's the last time you reviewed your organization's policy? Probably not since you started working at a company, right? So I recommend posting the relevant parts to Jira with your other Jira documentation, just so users might stumble upon it again and remember what is okay to do in your Jira application and what's not. All right, so next is sensitive information. And your advisory board should really determine what does that mean at your company? How do you define it as sensitive? And then what's permitted to do in your application? Now, your policy is going to depend a lot on your compliance standards, how access to sensitive data is controlled, your other policies, your industry, the laws in your country, even whether you accept credit card payments. There's so many factors. But my recommendation and the easiest way to handle it is just to not enter sensitive information into Jira or other applications that are just accessible to all users of the company. So for me, that includes things like passwords, social security numbers, mother's maiden names, health information, salary, citizen status, and then also any proprietary or confidential personal or company information. So I like to use Jira as a place to do work, not the place to store all your company secrets. So another example of some sensitive information is like asset details. So let's say you're doing asset management and you don't properly lock down that asset management project. A server IP address in the wrong hands, that information could be exploited. So no matter what you do, just be careful with it and you make a policy that really explains why you're going to do what you're going to do. And then finally, there might be other specific policies if your application to specific compliance. Here are some of the common ones. There's a lot out there. All right, the project templates. So Jira comes loaded with default schemes to get you started. And before you start building custom schemes, I recommend that you decide how many you're going to support. So I like to start out with just 3. I have one set of schemes for development type projects, one for support, and one for task-based projects. So we'll use development as an example. You might have an issue type scheme with epic, story, bug, task, subtask, the standard issue types for a dev project. And it might have specific dev fields like fix version, effects version, story points, sprints. And then the bug issue type might have a special workflow or special fields like steps to produce and expected result. So that's really, really common, right? That's a standard dev configuration. So I set that up, I document all the settings so the team knows what the template contains, and then I start a dev team off with this template until they have a real business need for a custom configuration. And a lot of times I find that this template is just fine for most people. All right, so after you're using your templates, you should have less customization in the future. But next you need to think about change management. And that really starts with a way to record what changes you're making in Jira and share them with your admin team and other users. I don't know where you're tracking your changes today, but hopefully not notes or email or nowhere at all. I love to use Jira to track my changes to Jira, and it works perfectly except when Jira is unavailable for maintenance. So just keep that in mind. If you're upgrading, you might not be able to access your change management plan if it's in Jira. Of course, you can also use Jira Service Desk if you have that. So what type of changes should admins track? Now, my personal rule, I document changes that only application or admins can make. All the other stuff is just probably not worth your time. So I wouldn't track like adding a component or something that a project level admin can do, but I would track installing a new add-on or creating a new permission scheme or setting up a new incoming mail handler. That's where I draw the line. You'll have to decide what's worth logging and what's not. So why bother? Didn't it sound like I just made a lot of work for you? Well, Jira's got an audit log, but it doesn't provide a whole lot of detail. It tells you some changes were made, it's got some timestamps and who made the change, but an audit log can never tell you why a certain change was made, who requested that change, and then other important change details. So that's what I like to capture in Jira. And then sometimes you got to make a change that you don't agree with or is not a great idea for the application. And in these cases, it's really important to have the why documentation. I mean, think about your future admins who are inheriting the changes that you're making. How are they going to understand or look back and say, well, why did they do that? Also, sometimes there's multiple ways to achieve the same thing. So your documentation is going to help you understand that change and the factors that influence the decision. So good to know, Atlassian has a free version of Jira Cloud now, but the free version doesn't include the audit log function. So you especially should track your changes if you're on the free version. Okay, let's start with a test environment. So it's shocking, but so many organizations I talk to, they don't have test environments at all. And I get it. I didn't have one either in the beginning. But I quickly saw how important it was to be able to experiment and learn without impacting production data. I made a lot of mistakes in production that I could have avoided if I had just done them in a test environment first. So if you don't have one, you need to set it up. You need a place to import just a small amount of your data to see how your changes are going to work with real life scenarios. So Gil said earlier on this call that he changed some link types the other day, and users came running and users came emailing saying, hey, why are my filters broken? So that's something you could potentially detect if you made that change in a test environment, and then you can understand the scope of that change without impacting your users. So real quick, so you don't accidentally make a change in prod while you think you're in your test environment, there's some visual changes that you can make. So first I changed my test instance to green, which is a different color than prod. I've got an announcement banner at the top, and I changed the instance display name to Jira Dev. And then also the URL is different, and also changed my avatar icon. And then some organizations also change the application logo on the top left. do everything you can do so you know that this is test and not production, and vice versa. All right, just a couple test environment tips. First, I would disable email in the test environment so you don't notify end users with duplicate or test data. And then if you have Jira Server or Data Center, I would give your application admin team read-only access to the database. So not to make changes in the database, but just to look at the records to understand what's being stored and how it's stored. And this will really solve a lot of mysteries and make you a better admin if you understand where things are stored. I've learned so much from hunting around in the database. And there's also things that you can see that's just not available in the admin UI. So it's enlightening. Let your teams hunt around. Right, so test environment options, there are many. I've listed my favorite at the top. If you're a cloud customer, that means Atlassian is hosting your instance, and you can get a second instance and pay the lowest license tier. There's also that free version that I mentioned. The free version is very similar to the paid, except it doesn't have permissions for projects or issues. So it's not useful for testing those areas of Jira. And then of course I mentioned already, it doesn't have the audit log. So that's why I put it under the second instance. I'd rather just pay for a small second instance that has all the features, but that's me. There's also a free trial that you can extend if you talk to Atlassian support. And then finally, if you have no better options at all, at least create a test project in your production instance. All right, server customers, where you're hosting your own software on-prem or in the cloud. A data center customer is very similar. You also got that free license for development and testing purposes. To get it, your technical contact needs to log in to my.atlassian.com and generate that license. Then you can also, of course, get a second instance and pay the lowest pricing tier. There's that 37-day trial. And then, of course, if nothing else, test project in production. So whichever method you choose, just make sure you have a place to test your changes before you unleash them on your users. Okay, so we talked a little bit about having a governance board of your own, but in addition to that advisory board, I recommend that you form a small group of ambassadors and use these folks to help share information, answer questions, and provide tier 1 support to your users. And I make this part of a project lead or project admin's duties. So great, you want to be a project admin, you're going to help out on the ambassador team as well. Congratulations. And then enlist power users to help. This is how I got my start with Jira. Actually, I was excited and interested in Jira, and somebody noticed and said, hey, why don't you start learning more about Jira? And that's how I became an admin. So these folks might make good future admins as well. All right, time for more swearing. Our next best practice is all about maintenance. So a maintenance strategy and some proactive action from your administrators, it's essential to a healthy application. You know, Jira doesn't maintain itself, right? Jira administrators are really important. So here are some things to determine. What maintenance actions are you going to perform regularly? How often are you going to perform them? And how will you communicate these to the end users? So on my list of things I want to do, I've got 23 maintenance actions, and I do them either quarterly or biannually, just depending on how we're using the instance. So download my schedule maintenance worksheet. It'll help you identify actions and document your plan. All right, this is just for server users or data center. There are 3 great tools to help you with your maintenance duties. And the first one I want to tell you about, it's the instance health check function, and it's part of the troubleshooting and support tools. So this helps check for common problems with your file system, attachments, index, database, lots of good stuff. And in this screenshot, you can see that the check has detected a problem. So click on that problem to see additional details and some clues for how to solve that issue. So when there's a problem, Jira shows admins an on-screen message. And you can control the frequency of those notifications by changing that setting that's shown on the right. Now, I like to get as many notifications from Jira as possible, just so I know what's going on. So I turn it up as high as possible, which is the default. All right, the next tool for server users is the integrity checker. And this checks for a variety of issue, search, permission, and workflow problems too. And I really like to run the workflow tests after I've made major workflow changes. You know, sometimes you bump a setting, sometimes you change something and you didn't mean to, sometimes something gets corrupted. this checker will help find those problems. So this might take a while to complete. It usually takes about 30 minutes in my instance. So just run some of the tests some of the time. Run them when they're appropriate. So you can see in this screenshot that there was a problem detected. And you can either try to explore it yourself and correct it on your own, or you can ask Jira to try to fix it for you. So for this case, I investigated the error, and it turned out that the reason I was getting this is I had permission scheme was no longer in the instance at all. I had deleted it. So I let Jira fix the error, and then I reran this checker, and it had fixed it. The error is gone, but I double checked to be sure. The last tool I want to talk about for server users is the Integrity Check for Jira. It's an app from Botron Software. You can get it at marketplace.atlassian.com. So this app detects filters, agile boards, and dashboards, which is great because my users create way too many of these. So what I love about this tool is that it tells you exactly what's wrong and even where to find the problem. You don't have to guess or hunt around. So in this example, I've got a broken JQL filter. It tells me the name of the filter, who owns it, the JQL that's wrong, and the name of the missing status, field, or selection. So I can either fix this on behalf of the user or go tell the user, hey, this filter is broken, go fix it. All right, next topic. Let's talk a little bit about cleanup. So periodically, we all need to audit what we have and then remove what we no longer need. So here's my archive checklist. And I say archive in quotes because the only real archive ability is in Jira Data Center, but there's also a new ability in Jira Server Premium for cloud users, so check that out. Now, none of my ideas are going to improve performance or take issues out of the index, but at least it's a step in the right direction and it gets this information out of front and center for your users. So here's what I do to make projects less visible. So first, I prepend X and the word archived to a project's name, and then all the archive projects are going to be listed together alphabetically at the bottom of the list. And then I also create a category also called X archived, and I put all old projects in that category. Next, I change the project's icon to some big scary X or a lock or something that shows that you shouldn't be using this project anymore. I use the project's description to add some copy. I usually write something like, this project data is still available for legal and historical reasons, but no new issues can be created or edited. And then I disable the ability to edit and transition issues. Now, sometimes I let issues be moved to another project, maybe for a period of time, but other times I just hide the project altogether. It depends. And then finally, I remove the notification scheme because it's no longer needed. So now the unneeded projects are archived, in quotes. I'll go through all the admin areas and look for unused and unneeded schemes and settings that I can delete. So here's a really easy example using the permission schemes admin page. So that second scheme, you can see it's not used by any projects. So I can safely delete that one. And the third scheme was created by Jira when the service desk project was created, and you can tell by how it's named. So first, I'd rename the name to something that represents its purpose instead of the name of the project using it. You want to share these schemes per project, not create one scheme per project. So that's another cleanup opportunity here. All right, once I cleaned up those two schemes, there's really nothing more I can do in this admin area. So I move on to the next area and I look for schemes to remove or improve. And this is obviously very manual and time consuming, but don't get overwhelmed. Just tackle one admin at a time and your Jira instance will be nice clean before you know it. Here's a quick tip. It's usually useful to know the ID of a scheme or a setting. And you can have the links in the actions columns to find it. And sometimes you can see the ID in your browser status bar as well. So in the second screenshot example, the scheme's unique ID is shown at the end. And then you can also get ID information from the Jira database if you gave your admin team access, like I recommended earlier. Okay, next, let's just briefly talk on cleaning custom fields. I have an entire course on this topic, so I'm just going to share my high-level checklist today. But first I want to say, don't just start deleting custom fields. You need information before you can make these deletion decisions. Deleting this custom fields cannot be undone, and custom field data can't be recovered. So be careful when clicking that delete button, or there will be real swearing. All right, so here's my method for reducing your custom field count. First step always is an audit. You really need to understand what you have right now before you start changing it. And it's also helpful to know how much it differs from the default Jira field list. So again, I've got a free worksheet where you can use to compare your application to a default installation. And then also figure out how many of your fields are standard and how many are custom. Next, there's a couple ways you can approach your audit. First, you can do a manual examination, or you can use an app from the Atlassian Marketplace to help. I've got these listed at the end of the presentation, so don't worry about writing them down, but some to check out are Configuration Manager for Jira, Optimizer for Jira, Custom Field Manager for Jira, and Admin Tools for Jira. So while these add-ons can help you tremendously with your research, just keep in mind only a human can determine the value of a specific field for your organization. So there's still going to be a little bit of manual work for you to do. Next, I like to make a list of all the fields, the names, and the types. And then I start researching and classifying each field. And then finally, identify the fields that you probably don't need anymore. Once you've got your list of unneeded fields, you've got to decide whether you want to retain the existing data or not. So if not, take a database backup and then remove that field from the admin UI. If you do want to retain the data, also take a database backup and then move or append that data to a different field. It's really easy to do. You can move data with either a workflow post function, with scripts, or with import-export utilities. So here's another list of apps to check out. And again, these are listed at the end of the presentation. But the following all do this: JSU Automation Suite for Jira workflows, Script Runner for Jira, and also the Jira command line interface. So whenever you're cleaning up your Jira instance, always go slow. Only change or delete one thing at a time so you can track the cause of any problems that arise. And just good to know, user filters are going to break after custom fields are removed. So you can be prepared for this, right? You can use that integrity check for Jira app I showed you to detect those problems and help users fix their filters. All right, after you've completed your data migration and all your field deletions, it's a good idea to do a re-index. Re-indexes can impact performance, so always do them outside of peak hours. If you have cloud, it'll re-index for you. And then after any cleanup activity, be sure to update your documentation and log your changes in your Jira configuration change project. Finally, add a custom field audit to your regular Jira maintenance schedule. This is kind of like a thing you've got to do periodically. You can't just do it once and, oh, my instance is clean and we're good for the rest of my life. You got to keep doing it. And then also, if you just resist the urge to create unneeded custom fields, you'll have less to clean up in the future. So whenever a new custom field is requested in my instance, I always ask the user if and how they're going to report on that data. And if they're not going to report on that data, that's not a good use of a custom field. So I only create custom fields that are going to be queried. All right, next up, we all have super long workflows. I just helped a company who had a 25-step workflow go to 6. Yes, it's possible. So while you're improving your config settings, look for ways to make these workflows more efficient as well. There's not a performance impact, but your users will be happier. So instead of capturing every little possible step in your workflow, I like to use a phased approach. And with the phases, you just break up your process into groups that represent a collection of smaller steps. So this way, each phase represents a status in Jira, and all the small little steps that you're going to do in the meantime, they don't also need to be statuses. So my simple example is, imagine your company is going to sign a partnership agreement with another company. You can use something short and phased, like open, in review, in execution, and closed. So here's that written out in phases. And even though this is super simple, the legal teams, they're doing many things in the background. They just don't need to be reflected in Jira. So for example, in the in review phase, the legal team's doing a lot. They're reviewing the contract, they're researching legal topics, communicating with internal teams, negotiating terms with the external company. And in the in execution status, the CEO is finding his favorite signing pen and both companies are trading paperwork back and forth. And your legal team is entering the final documents into their contracts database. This phased approach is always more flexible than a super long workflow. So if you're not going to query for issues in a certain status, that's a clue that the status might not be necessary or useful. So it's the same test for a custom field or a new status, right? I want the person requesting it to tell me how they're going to query, how they're going to use it. And if they don't have a good answer for that, that's not a good business case. All right, next is training. So you've got to deliberately train your admins, right? They're not going to learn this stuff by osmosis on their own. I also like to train project admins, power users, service desk agents, and end users. And I train all these people differently. So focus on determining your training needs and your timeline, how to encourage adoption, and then how to deliver information on an ongoing scale. I find it works much better to give people information as they need it instead of putting everybody in a room and making them listen to me talk about Jira for 8 hours. So also determine which information each role is most interested in. So for example, like a brand new user, they just want the basics. Don't overwhelm them with too much information. Just answer questions like, what is Jira? How do I use it? How do I access it? And stop there. Sometimes I give them homework. Go create one Jira issue for something you have to complete today. And that's it. And then a regular and occasional user, you know, they want information about sharing, organizing their data, creating filter subscriptions, linking, logging time. So I have specific training for those topics. Power users want information about basic and advanced search, JQL, bulk changes. And then team leads, project managers, and scrum masters, they use Jira a lot differently. They want to know about views, managing issues on dashboards, boards, and reports. Service desk agents, you know, they obviously want to know about how to meet their SLA so their boss isn't coming to their desk every day. And then how to use the additional JSD features to support their customers. And application admins like you and me, you know, we want to know about configuration, performance, effective workflows, best practices, mistakes, and certification. All right, so here's the final swear. Above all, I will leave Jira in a healthier state than I inherited it. That's the overall goal, right? So you've probably heard of the Hippocratic Oath or phrase, first do no harm. You know, this is a list of ethical statements for doctors. So for us, we've got the Jirocratic Oath. And you can think of it as the 10 commandments for Jira. And these were the statements we saw throughout the presentation. So you take the Jirocratic Oath, the URL shown, and download your certificate. This will look fabulous on your office wall. All right, so here's the slide I mentioned with all the URLs, the apps, and the download links. Take a screenshot or take a photo with your camera of this. This will be useful later. And then finally, if you want to share your feedback on this presentation so I can improve it for the next group, go to the URL listed and submit feedback, and I'll enter you to win a digital copy of the Jira Strategy Admin Workbook. All right, there's that slide again with all the resources. What questions can I answer for folks?